make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Yeah, I think that to go back to maybe where we started this interview, I think one of the things that I am just kind of struck by the more that I study American history is, especially America's religious history, is this continuing theme of a theological crisis. And so I think if we can take that outside of the Civil War period that it's often applied to as this theological crisis that kind of led to the Civil War, and extend that both before and after, I think the story of religion in America for 250 years has been a story of people disagreeing about what the Bible says and what God intends. And I think that our moment today seems polarized, and indeed is polarized, but I don't think we should lose heart that this is something completely unique in our history, that this is kind of like a continuing theme that we have, and that if we perhaps seek understanding and unity in these moments of polarization, that maybe the way forward is to kind of try to recapture that gospel call of unity, rather than ever more increasingly divorcing ourselves from people who don't think the same way we do about how we read our Bibles or what the Bible means.
Hey, welcome back to Church and State 250, where we are looking at over 250 years of faith in America. In this series, we are looking at the role religion has played, shaping all kinds of things like history, our politics, our law, culture, and even public life. And one of the harder parts of that story is actually how Christians have used the Bible, not only to defend their private beliefs, but to defend systems of power. So that's why we brought on our guest today, which is J. Russell Hawkins. He is the Dean of John Wesley's Honor College and Professor of Honors Humanities and History at Indiana Wesleyan University. He's the author of the excellent book, The Bible Told Them So, How Southern Evangelicals Fought to Preserve White Supremacy, which looks at how white Southern evangelicals use scripture and theology to resist racial equality during and after the civil rights movement. And we are just so happy to have Rusty back with us today for this series. So welcome back to Faith and Politics, Rusty.
Thanks, guys. Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, no problem. And I should ask, you go by Rusty, right? Not Russell?
I do. I go by Rusty. I'm one of those confusing middle name guys.
Because every person that we've talked to, we're like, yeah, and Russell Hawkins is going to, come on and talk to us. And they're just like, Russell. And then I'm like, Rusty. Oh, Rusty. Yeah. He's got a great book. Yeah. So in this series, we are looking at how religion has shaped America over the past 250 years. And when we get to the period of after slavery and into Jim Crow, I think is probably the best place for us to start, given your expertise in your book. So I'd love just for you to kind of give us kind of the big picture view of what role did religion play, in America after, say, the antebellum period of the South?
Yeah, great question. Great way to start. And I would say that the role that religion played after the Civil War is very similar to the role that religion played before the Civil War. So my book in particular is looking at the period around the emergence of the political civil rights movement in the 1950s, but the run-up to that was also very interesting. And I think as we think about this in terms of theology and the way that Christians interpreted their Bibles. And so one of the more foundational texts in American religious history is a book by Mark Knoll called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. It's probably come up from time to time in these interviews that you've been doing, but one of the arguments, terrific book, can't recommend it highly enough, but one of the arguments that he makes in that book is that ultimately you have to understand that part of the conflict of the American Civil War was that Christians couldn't agree on how to read their Bibles. And so you had a good group of Christians who said the Bible is anti-slavery, and you had another sizable group of Christians that said, no, the Bible is absolutely pro-slavery. And because these two sides couldn't resolve their theological interpretations, the Civil War had to do that for them. So one of the things that I'm trying to show in my book is that after the Civil War, that theological crisis lives on. And that's, I think, is one of the enduring themes about religion in American history, is that it's a perpetual theological crisis as Christians perpetually disagree on how to understand what the Bible says on any given number of topics. So as it relates to the civil rights movement, we have another theological crisis. And what's happening there is the crisis of two groups of Christians who see God on different sides of the civil rights struggle. So there's one group of Christians coming out of the Black church in particular who says that this Jim Crow segregation that's been part of our country now for the last 60, 70 years by the 1950s is abhorrent, and it's an affront to the human dignity that all of us who are created in the image of God hold. And so we need to do away with these political systems of segregation to be good Christians. And then in the South, you had another group of Christians who were saying that, well, we shouldn't do that because God is the one who set up these systems of segregation, set up these racial differences. And if we do away with this segregation, just Jim Crow, then we're going to end up doing away with God's intent for society and intent for these races to remain apart from each other. And so once again, what we're seeing here by the period of the civil rights movement in American history is this perpetual theological crisis around this question about segregation.
Yeah, what were the scriptural and theological justifications that were used to defend segregation, right? We're going to talk about, and we've talked about in another episode in the series, the arguments for slavery.
Sure.
That were used. And obviously it's very complex looking at the difference between slavery. Slavery as an institution is an awful thing. And yet it was probably understood slightly differently, even though there was a through line from ancient world, right, where the Bible was written, to the antebellum South. One glaring difference, right, was it was not racialized in the same way at all in the ancient world as it was in the South, New World slavery. But moving past that, like we'll look at that, but a lot of those arguments probably, they set the foundation for the segregation arguments. And I would love to understand, how were they actually crafting the biblical argument for segregation, and how did the defenders or the apologists for segregation at the time, how did they square that with the culture that was around them, and even some of the Bibles that might parts of the Bible that would, that would be a counter narrative or against what they're saying?
Yeah, great question. So I'll preface this answer by saying that none of these scriptures that I'm going to give you here will be convincing to anyone. I mean, this is just going to sound outlandish, and just like these are just like mental gymnastics that you have to go to even follow some of the logic. But really what these segregationist Christians did is they went through the Bible starting in Genesis and going all the way through Revelation. And what they were able to do was to find this consistent thread of segregation, and in their minds, this translated to racial segregation, beginning with the Tower of Babel story in Genesis and ending all the way to the throne room in heaven and the final chapters of Revelation. So the way they started this was just by saying that, well, look, as early as the Tower of Babel, what we see here is God as the original segregator, because what he's doing there is separating the different races of mankind at Babel. And then throughout the pages of subsequent scriptures, God is just always consistent about not intermixing different peoples and even different things. So these segregationists would look at the Levitical code, where it says you can't plant different seeds from different kind of crops in the same row. You can't weave different kind of fabrics in the same garment. These are part of God's revealing his desire to keep those things that are created differently apart from each other. They talked extensively about the prohibitions on Israel from intermarrying with different cultural groups. And they're seeing this as kind of the same kind of banishment that races should also approach intermarriage with, that you shouldn't marry someone from a different group. They talked about the fact that when Isaac needed a wife, they went back to his people and found a wife from his people. They talked about what happened to Solomon when he started intermarrying. They talked about what happened to Samson when he was led astray by Delilah, these other people. So in the Old Testament, they had no problem kind of like weaving this defense of segregation into the the biblical prohibitions against intermarriage, in particular with Israel. When it got to the New Testament, it got a little bit trickier, but they still were able to find scriptures that supported their positions, or lack of scriptures that supported the opposite position. So, for instance, they said, Jesus didn't say anything about mixing. He didn't say anything about undoing some of those Levitical laws or prohibitions against intermarriage in the Old Testament. In fact, Jesus said that he came to uphold the law. So those same kind of instructions about intermixing should still be in effect in the New Testament. And then they even went so far as to say things like, look, Paul and Barnabas, two God-fearing men, they even split. They go their separate ways. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes segregation, separation is just what is needed. They talked about Jesus when he comes back in the second coming and at the judgment seat will sort the goats from the sheep as being indication that he has no problem separating people as well. And even in Revelation 7:9, where they talk about in heaven, people of all tribes and tongues will be worshiping before the throne. They said, well, see, even when we get to heaven, we're going to be different tribes, we're going to have different tongues. And so that segregation that was started at Babel, this is something that we have to maintain here on earth so that when we get to heaven, we will have our different unique cultures and tribes and tongues that will still be there. So that's kind of the way that they wove these arguments all through Scripture. And then to your question, too, about how they seem to counteract those scriptures, like when Paul's writing Galatians about in Christ there's neither Greek nor Jew, slave nor free. He talked of, or the segregationists talked of, in those senses, well, yeah, I mean, we understand spiritually. He's talking about spiritually we can be united. But when Paul's saying these things, obviously there are Greeks and there are Jews, there are men, there are women. I mean, we're not saying we're no longer men and women. We're just saying that those differences don't have to keep us from being spiritually united. So these segregationist Christians were fine to say this is spiritual unification we can talk about, that Scripture seems to be pointing at, but not this intermixing that might lead to intermarriage, that might lead to the amalgamation of races, which might lead to race mixing on a level that they were afraid countered God's will. There's also, I know that in other episodes, if you talked about the slavery, the pro-slavery arguments, the curse of Ham obviously played a huge role in that, in the slavery debates. The equivalent in the segregation debates, if there was an equivalent, would probably be a passage in Acts 17. Acts 17:26 became the crucial linchpin for these segregationists, in large part because this is a two-part verse. So in the first part of the verse, Paul is saying to the Athenians that, hey, God created from one man, from one blood, all of the different races of the world. And the pro-civil rights groups would tend to point to that and say, hey, listen, we're all the same. We all come from Adam. We all come from the same descendants. So we're all one. But the segregationists say, yeah, but you stopped reading your Bible too soon, because Paul also goes on to say, and after he made all the different races from one man, he also then set the bounds of their habitation. And that is what the segregationists would point to time and again, saying God is the one who said that you should live there, we should live here, those folks should live over there, and this separation of the races is something that he intended. So all of those arguments, I mean, and they're so almost just absurd sounding today. I mean, I think one of the important lessons from this is that what this ultimately reveals is that good and proper exegesis or good faithful theology or hermeneutics, in our context in the United States, none of that really matters as much as making sure you have a critical mass of people who go along with your interpretation. And in a kind of a Protestant setting with these democratic impulses, when it comes to scriptural interpretation, majority rules. So as long as you can give a majority of people say, you know what, that interpretation sounds good to me, I'll run with that. And that's what we saw during that civil rights period, especially for these white conservative Christians in the South.
I'm sitting here and I've read your book. I understand, somewhat of the relationship of religion and American politics, but as as we're sitting here, the Southern Baptist Church just recently voted to harden their rules on women pastors, and I'm here not a Baptist, just thinking like, well, okay, why should I care, right? Like, I'm not a Baptist, not my church, didn't go to the conference, so like when we are thinking about the way that churches viewed things like segregation, like why is that important to sort of American history? I mean, we all know that segregation is bad. Or most of us think segregation is bad. And that's a view that was a popular view held by the church during the civil rights era. But like, what relevance does it have, for Americans that, may not be a part of the church?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Women were vital to the history of American Christianity. But now growing numbers of women are quitting the church over misogyny, abuse, racism, homophobia, and the big banner that seems to connect it all, Christian nationalism. I'm Sarah Stancorp, and my new book, Damned If She Does, is about why millions of American women have quit church and what it means for the future. Keep listening at the end of this episode for an exclusive Faithful Politics sneak peek.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things. So for Americans who aren't part of the church, let me answer that first. And then if you don't mind, I'd like to say I think there are implications for Americans who are part of the church too. So for Americans who aren't part of the church, I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind here is that religion is a really crucial function for so many Americans and how they make sense of the world around them. And so if you think about something like, talk about like the civil rights movement, or talk about like a moment in the movement where it gets launched by a seemingly political decision in the Brown, or a judicial decision in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. If you view these things only as political movements or only as judicial movements and don't understand the religious implications that these things have, you might miss how central some of these things are, or how important or how deep some of these beliefs run in the lives of your fellow Americans, in a way that I think we would be well to understand these things at the depth that religion holds for so many people. Sorry, the word salad there. Well, let me try to come at that again and just say it this way, that like, if you reduce these things just to political beliefs and don't understand that they're also related to deeply held religious beliefs, I think that we may miss how profoundly important some of these issues are. And you can think, well, these are just political differences, and maybe if we sit down and like talk through these political differences, we can like find common ground. And that may be true, but also understand that you're coming with these at a level of cosmology for some of these folks that means, man, these are deeply, deeply held beliefs that come from places beyond just my being swayed by a political argument. I mean, once you think that God was the one who said that women should not preach, I mean, that's going to have deep implications for the way that you understand your politics as well. So appreciating that, even for people who aren't Christians, as they think about these things, I think is important. I think for those of us who are in the church, the reason it's important to kind of like think about this history of segregation that happened in the past and the way that some Christians defended this, all that theology that I just gave to you, it came from a place after the American Civil War of Christians isolating themselves into their different racial groups. And so it's really difficult to think that level of segregationist theology could be as robustly developed if it was being developed in spaces where Black Christians were worshiping in pews beside white Christians. And as I think about the Gospel of John and Jesus' prayer in John, and actually like just so much of Jesus' message being a message of unity, and we need each other. And I think one of the reasons why that's such an important role in John 17 in particular is this idea that if we need each other to safeguard against having some really weird ideas that can come into play if we are isolated from people who aren't like us. And I think this should be an important lesson for us in the church today, as we tend to more and more separate ourselves and divide ourselves and to like leave people that we disagree with. All that ultimately does is make it that much more difficult to like understand the fullness of what God is calling us to, that we need to when and can only come about when we have believers of different persuasions and different experiences and different backgrounds coming together to bring all those different things into play as they are reading scriptures and trying to make sense of it. So I think for that reason too, if we can look to the past, this segregationist history matters because these people didn't think that they were the baddies, just like we today don't ever think that we might be wrong about something, but it should be a lesson to keep us humble that maybe our theological convictions and biblical interpretations could be re-examined and challenged from time to time and might benefit from doing so.
Yeah, I agree. Will wrote a great Substack about that, thinking through the ideas of segregation, slavery, the ways that Christians really thought those, not just like they made an argument because it was politically motivated, although politics was certainly part of that, but like, as you're saying, these were deeply held theological beliefs.
Yeah.
They're ontological in their implications. It's had to do with how God created reality. All right. And so maybe the crazy liberals or maybe the people that were non-segregationists, they might have arguments. We have to somewhat live with them, but they're not actually living in accordance with reality. I mean, that's how they believed, correct?
Correct. That's right.
So you look at this and you see that they truly believed that segregation was a part of God's design. It wasn't just an instrumental belief, right? That they didn't actually commit to, but this was something that they thought was a part of reality. And of course, then this would have implications for schools, for churches, for neighborhoods, for public life. And I want to get into that, but I want to do it in the context of Brown v. Board of Education, because this has a lot to do with schools and regular life. And of course, this idea of separate but equal. And the question here is, of course, the problem was it wasn't equal, and the separate its own issue, but it seems like it also wasn't equal, which creates its own host of issues. And yet we often hear this taught. When I was taught about Brown v. Board of Education, I was taught that it was a terrible decision, and that it was a legal or essentially told it was a legal or political story. But this is actually a religious story.
Wait,
and
Josh,
so,
just to clarify, were you told Brown v. Board of Education was a bad decision? Or
no. Sorry. I meant the one that created separate but equal. I apologize.
Yeah.
The one that created separate but equal. Brown v. Board. Yeah, you can mark that and take that out, or you can. I had a slip. You would do that, dude. But that was a great decision. But the separate but equal was a terrible decision. This was a religious story, though, right? And this is something that we're not taught in schools. That was my point. The religious aspect of all this. How is this a religious story? Bringing in Brown v. Board of Education, how is this religious? How did it correct what happened before, and what was the result of this?
Yeah, great question. And I hope they don't take out your slip, because I think that what you accidentally said that you were taught that it was a terrible decision was exactly what so many Christians were saying. And if you read the literature, like, this was a terrible decision. I mean, at the time, they called it Black Monday, because May 17th was a Monday when this decision was handed down. And so they called it Black Monday, was this day that the Supreme Court upended God's will and just made this decision suddenly in 1954, thousands of years after God had made it plain what his intent was. Now suddenly the Brown decision said the Supreme Court justices have wisdom that like previously no one else had. And so they're just upending decades, if not centuries worth of practice. So the Brown decision is really interesting to examine as a religious belief as well, because there's also church denominations who come out in support of this. So the big three denominations in the South, the Southern Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, all issue statements in support of this. And so from their perspective, the denominational leaders would share what many of us today would say about this decision, was that this is a morally just decision. But the fascinating thing about this is, as they tried to get these different proclamations approved at their denominational meetings, this is where you can see that there's a much deeper story here. So in the case of the Southern Baptists, they bring this to the floor, and the Southern Baptists are interesting because nothing that gets said at Southern Baptist convention, I mean, they don't even call it, it's not a denomination, it's convention. So nothing that happens there has any bearing. You're not bound to anything that happens there as your individual Baptist church. So they're just making a proclamation that none of the churches there who send their messengers actually have to say, all right, now our denomination is supporting this. But they decide in 1954 to go ahead and say, yeah, we endorse the Brown decision. So they bring forward this memorial, this proposal to do just that, saying that Southern Baptists are going to be supportive of this Brown decision. And this fight erupts the convention floor, where these pastors and laymen are getting up and they're saying that we don't support this. This is against the will of God. This is actually anti-biblical. And so what you can appreciate in the Brown decision is that if you understand it simply as a political morality tale years later, as we do, it's like, oh, finally the Supreme Court helped the country in the right head in the right direction. And you miss all the religious arguments around this decision that were taking place at the same time. You can kind of reduce the complexity of history here in a really important way, a really significant way. And I think this is why I think it's so important that we bring this religious aspect into the story, because it helps us understand what exactly it was that the civil rights activists were up against. What they were up against was this deeply held ontological theological beliefs that God didn't want the Supreme Court ruling to go the direction that it was going.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. So Brown v. Board of Education, passed, if that's probably not the right term, but it made segregation no longer a thing, right? So, but it applied to, no, well, yeah.
Sort of. Yeah.
Sort of, right.
No, not. Actually, not really at all, but
but the impact wasn't immediate, right? It took a while, and specifically, private Christian colleges were largely exempt when it first happened. I think, and this is where you can correct me. So I'd love to just fact check that, and then two, what was the response by private Christian colleges after Brown?
Yeah, so. Brown in 1954 is a great rhetorical victory for civil rights, for the emerging civil rights movement. I mean, it basically says that the Supreme Court will be on the side of integration. But the very following year, in 1955, what doesn't get talked about is Brown 2. And Brown 2 was the implementation ruling of the previous year's ruling. Brown 2's, the Supreme Court comes back and says, all right, how and when are we going to say that schools can no longer be segregated? And in the Brown 2 ruling the next year, they basically just kicked the legs out of the ruling the previous year. They told the South, okay, we need to integrate the public schools of the South with all deliberate speed. And all deliberate speed is this really unhelpful, vague term, which basically meant whenever you can get around to it, just make this a priority. And that just allowed Southern governments to basically say, yeah, we're not quite ready yet. Maybe 20 years or so we'll get around to this. So I think it's something like some staggering number, like a decade after. So by 1964, I think less than 1% of Southern public schools had actually had any integration. It wasn't actually bringing any change. The thing that really brings a change is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is what actually gives the federal government the onus to go in and start pushing for some of this integration to take place. Now, what's left unsaid to your question is private Christian colleges. Because they're private, they get to make their own rules. So they weren't even held to the Brown decision of 54 because they weren't a public school. So public universities in the South, they were forced to integrate if a Black undergraduate or graduate student pushed the issue, but for these Christian colleges, they didn't have to. Interesting, though, in 1964, one of the effects of the Civil Rights Act that gets passed that year is it ties federal funding to integration of your institution. So the federal government will withhold funding from you if you still practice integration. And it's really the civil rights ruling in 64 that causes these Christian colleges to ask these questions, do we want to integrate? And this is another moment in this history that you get to see what white Christians thought about this, because now the question is live, even though for a decade, the Supreme Court has already said segregation is no longer the law of the land for public institutions. This didn't change the practices at these colleges. It's not until federal money gets tied into this that they start revisiting this question. And they have to take votes, and they have to write letters, and they have to go to the alumni. And time and again, what we're seeing here is that the constituents of the college, the alumni, the students, parents who are there, they're writing in saying, we don't want to integrate. We don't want to integrate. This is against God's law. The Southern Baptist Convention actually put this up to a vote in South Carolina, where I write about. And the messengers that come, they all cast their votes against it. Now, because it's a Baptist institution, they're not bound to those. And so the school goes ahead and chooses the money rather than abiding by the will of its constituents. But it integrates not because necessarily they understood Scripture differently, but because they needed the federal funding that was going to help with the science initiatives and the building projects that were going on campus. So that was just another moment where you can, if you're wondering the difference between what's happening at the higher levels of the denomination and what the peoples in the pews actually thought, the debates around desegregating the private schools, the Baptist and Methodist schools in South Carolina that my book covers, that's a way that you can see what's still going on in their minds.
And how? Just real fast, Josh. How does Bob Jones fit into kind of the whole story? Oftentimes, when I read things about Brown v. Board of Education, I read about Bob Jones. They didn't fully, or they didn't integrate until 1970 or something. But it's the student had to be married because they had a lot of anti-interracial marriage laws. So yeah, what's Bob Jones' kind of role in this?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Bob Jones, but suffice it to say that Bob Jones was fiercely independent school, so wasn't tied to larger denominational funding or oversight. And so they did keep segregation on their campus. I want to say it was even into the 80s in terms of not allowing for interracial marriage on campus. And it wasn't until the Supreme Court, I think under the Reagan administration, that they had to go to the Supreme Court and argue before the Supreme Court that theirs was a religious belief, and so they should have a religious exemption from the integration clause of the 64 Civil Rights Act that allowed them to get federal money or could take federal money for scholarships, despite the fact that they still practice segregation on campus. The Supreme Court ruled against them, but that was something that wasn't decided until the 1980s. They took it all the way into the 80s. The other interesting thing, though, about even schools that had anti-marriage ordinances, interracial marriages ordinances in place before, even outside the South, schools that I'm familiar with, they had prohibitions in their student handbooks against interracial marriage before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. They kept those things in the student handbook after the Civil Rights Act of 64. Once the federal funding kind of came in there, they changed the wording of the student handbooks, but the practices still remained the same. And so the wording came out of the handbooks, but the students themselves had experiences where they would get called into the dean of students' office if they were talking to a co-ed of a different race and be told, hey, interracial marriage isn't really God's plan for us, so you should cool your jets on that relationship.
It's amazing.
It really is.
Yeah, it truly is. And just the lack of logic and how much it really does. It's based in something that isn't logic. It's bounded logic, right? And I think all of us are subject to that. We reason within limits. We reason within, of course, what we know and within our background knowledge and what we believe, right? And if we've been taught that, the mixture is wrong, it's going to have an emotional reaction, even when logically we can't see why. We're going to have the emotional reaction, the elephant, to use Jonathan Haidt's term to coin that or borrow it, I guess. And that elephant is going to go crazy because that's what they're taught, right? Even today, like thinking about the way that my parents were taught. My dad grew up in segregation, right? He was born in 1947. He remembers when schools were integrated. He remembers the civil rights movement and the civil rights laws, like the Civil Rights Act. And he remembers those. And he remembers the turmoil around that, and then the way he raised us. But you see, like, the difference in thinking from my grandfather, which was vastly different than me, to now. It's pretty amazing. And even growing up in church, like, I never once heard ever that I interpreted in church growing up. Now, I went to a church in Northern Virginia near DC, right? It wasn't like some ultra conservative church, at least by my standards, but it's certainly conservative. But I never heard anything about, like, all I heard was racism is bad. Everyone's made equal. Like, that's all I heard. And then hearing, right, the reality that it wasn't just at the meso level, right, the institutional level of a college or whatever, but even getting to the micro level of churches. I guess churches would be institutions, but even I'm thinking major, huge institutions, corporations, things like that. But small churches, local level is really what I'm getting at. What was it like there, right? Because my understanding is that I'm assuming the Supreme Court said segregation is no longer okay. And of course, we just said not everyone just believed that immediately. They didn't change their mind because the Supreme Court told them. And I get that. Nobody really changes their mind because the Supreme Court tells them. So
yes.
What did that resistance look like at the local level? We've talked about kind of the meso level, but can you get a little more granular as much as you can? Church statements, sermons, at the local level, Christians in the pews. We've mentioned it some, but what was that? How was segregation talked about? How was it framed? What were the arguments? How was it, just discussed in the context on the local level?
Yeah, great question. At the local level, so I think what you see here is, I just really love the way you framed the question in terms of the Supreme Court says this, and it does have the effect of changing something, but it doesn't change beliefs. So in the same way,
in later generations, it changes beliefs more, right? After it's been enshrined. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think if you think about this as just a historical analogy from like slavery, and so you had all like the debate that rages over slavery in the run up to the Civil War, this theological crisis, as Mark Noll calls it. And then the war happens, the 13th Amendment gets passed, and just slavery's off the table. And so what you see in the immediate aftermath of slavery, and I have a friend and colleague, Luke Harlow, who's a historian at the University of Tennessee, who writes about this, but in the immediate aftermath of that, you see all these pro-slavery Christians who are still talking about the fact that, all right, well, slavery's gone now, so the issue's moot, but we weren't wrong. We weren't wrong how we understood this as the scripture supporting slavery. But the issue itself is just kind of taken off the table. And I think we see the same thing happening in local churches after the Brown and the Civil Rights Movement, the triumph of the success of the Civil Rights Movement in 1964 and 65. They're basically saying that, okay, we still think that God's a segregationist, but the Supreme Court has ruled, the Congress has acted, the president has signed this into law, culture is changing around us. So what does that mean for us? And if you look at this at the local level, at churches that were completely voluntary in their nature, so the Southern Baptists, I think, in particular, are really helpful here. For them, it didn't mean a whole lot because lo and behold, what happened after the Civil Rights Movement in their churches is that their churches remained predominantly white, and there was really no change for them. And so if you contrast that with what happens in the Methodist denomination, this is where it becomes, I think, so much more fascinating. So what happens in the Methodist denomination, and they have a fascinating history in their own right, but the Methodists are a Jim Crow church as early as the 1920s, when after the Civil War, the Methodist Church comes back together. But for the Southern Church to go along with this reunification, they had safeguards put in place to make sure that there wouldn't be interracial churches and there wouldn't be black pastors that get appointed to white churches. So they had like this weird kind of Jim Crow structure in the Methodist Church. So when the civil rights movement gained steam and 60s turn into the 70s, the Methodists start looking at their own church and they're saying, oh man, we got to demolish these segregationist structures in our church. And this is where the local church in the Methodist denomination start really kind of like freaking out about this, because they're saying, man, this is going to undo God's will in these churches. So what they ended up adopting as a defense mechanism against these changes was a new weapon that they forged called colorblindness. And what these Methodist Christians started saying was, the real issue, and they're saying this by like the early 1970s, the real problem is that we spend too much of our efforts and our attention as Christians talking about race and trying to fix the problem of racism. And we would just be so much better off if we just stopped talking about race. Now, on one hand, you might hear that and think, oh, okay, well, maybe if we're charitable here, they would just genuinely want to get beyond the issue of race. But you have to understand the context that they're wielding this tool. These are the same people who for years, decades, have been writing about how God doesn't want the races to mix. These are the same people who are now in the context where denominational structure is saying, we're going to be intentional about mixing. And then and only then do these people start saying, hey, we'd be better off if we just stopped paying attention to race all the time. Stop trying to like force this integration. Just let it happen naturally if it's going to happen. And so what I argue in my research, I think what my research shows is that this gospel of colorblindness was born at this moment of trying to maintain segregation in the local church. And what this ultimately does is that colorblindness becomes the way moving into subsequent generations, like Josh sounds like you had and I had, that when we come along in our white churches, and I'm assuming that you grew up in a white church, we grew up with this message that racism is bad, but even more bad is like talking about it all the time. And we'd be better off if we just stopped talking about it. And racism is basically just what I feel in my heart. So as long as I'm not racist, I don't feel bad in my heart towards someone of a different race, I would be best served if I just didn't even like pay attention to it and just was colorblind. And I think that if we don't understand the origins of colorblindness and where that rhetorical device kind of like entered into the churches and how it was used as a tool of segregation at its origins, we don't appreciate the way that today it kind of maintains itself, I think unintentionally so, but maintains itself today as a tool of segregation. Because to be colorblind is to basically say that racism is only a problem if we make it a problem. So let's not talk about it, let's not make it a problem, and then it will just go away. And I think that has just perpetuated the divide over the racialized church that persists today. But it comes from this moment of not understanding our past and where these arguments came from and how we inherited it in the future. I might have said too much already, but if I could just like follow this up with one thing, I all the chapters in my book, I intentionally open them with like this little story from the previous century. So I write about this church in Orangeburg, South Carolina, that had like this big debate in their congregation in the 1960s. Their pastor seemed to indicate that he was okay with the Brown decision, so they're in the process of forcing him out. And when I was in South Carolina doing research, I went to the Orangeburg First Baptist Church just to kind of like put myself in that space where this decades before this kind of like local church brouhaha kind of went down. I just wanted to be in that space. And I found it fascinating that right across the street from this church was a Confederate soldier, a memorial to the Confederacy. And I was just sitting there on the steps of this church, just kind of reflecting on this, thinking about like, man, in the 1950s, that thing would have been there. And these people would have gone to church every Sunday in this culture that just said, hey, look, the Confederacy was right. And the monument itself was just like this paying tribute to the fallen heroes of the Confederacy and what they fought for. And I thought, for these people in the 1950s who are being told that they need to integrate and that the Supreme Court was right, they had been conditioned in this culture for decades, like going to church without even probably thinking about like the celebration of the Confederacy that they're a part of. And I did that intentionally in my book as a way to kind of like highlight for us today that if we're not attentive to the history that we've inherited, that we've just kind of like lived with comfortably, that we might be kind of missing some things as well. And I think for us, it's this, for us white people, white Christians in particular, it's that kind of like the heritage of colorblindness without really even giving any kind of critical questions about where it came from, that we continue just to live comfortably with, that we do well to like look more into the history of where that thing came from, because it might help us ask better questions about how we can be faithful Christians in the present and future if we did so.
You know, when I look back at American history, especially in the religious context, and this series has been really, really beneficial just for me personally, just to kind of better understand and contextualize what that relationship looks like. You know, we just finished talking about Brown v. Board of Education, took place in 1954, but there was like, even after Brown, like just a flurry of wins or, you know, victories for some groups, not necessarily like white Christians, but like Engel v. Vattel, which eliminated voluntary like prayer in public schools. There's Torcaso v. Watkins, which got rid of the like religious test in Maryland. You know, add that to like Brown v. Board of Education, and it's like if you were a Christian in America, I would guess you'd probably start feeling a little bit like what's happening to our country. You know, we're losing our faith or our religion. I'd love for you just kind of maybe put some of that, you know, those court cases and just stuff we talked about in context during that time. Like is your sense that white Christians at that moment were kind of feeling the walls come in on them a little bit?
Oh, for sure. And especially for the white Christians in the South, by the 1970s, they stopped talking about Brown so much as a problem and started talking about these decisions about the prayer in school. That was a much more, palatable argument even by the 1970s. And again, I don't say that as like that was just a cover. I mean, that was a cloak. I mean, I think you're right that there is a real sense that they are feeling more and more embattled as the culture around them is changing. And I think it had the response to this was this desire to dig in and to approach this as a battle that needed to be won. And so the kind of defensive posturing of these decisions that again and again seem to be going against them didn't seem to them to be an opportunity to live faithful among the barbarians of Rome, but instead seemed to be like the falling of Christian Rome that they needed to like surge to the walls to make sure they're withholding. So I think that all of these decisions kind of taken together help to kind of create in the minds of white evangelicals in particular this feeling of being embattled and thriving as a result of that, because it's really easy to like, I think, marshal people to a call to militaristic like engagement. It's much more difficult to call people to faithfully live alongside these rulings from the emperor that mean you're going to end up a martyr. So I think Christian Smith and others wrote a book about evangelicals in the maybe late 90s, early 2000s called American Evangelicalism, Embattled and Thriving. But I think that very much has taken the flavor of some parts of the church today that they kind of need that enemy to fight to have a sense of victory. And I think this comes out of that or have a sense of purpose, I should mean. And that comes out of this moment in the 60s when all these decisions are going against them.
So, I totally can understand. Like we talked to John Fea, and he talked about how he teaches people to empathize with the people from the past without necessarily sympathizing. Those are the words that he used. And so, meaning that the empathy is you try to understand the reasoning, the worldview, the values, so that you can actually understand what this person is saying, even if you find their content, their views deplorable. You empathize so that you can understand. You enter into their world so that you can understand it, even
Correct.
if you're trying to dismantle it, right?
Yes.
And understand the logic behind it. That's what a historian does. And so as you're entering into the minds of segregationists, right, understanding their arguments, understanding their worldview, I guess my question is, what did you see that humanized them? In the sense, obviously, the human element of like, yeah, that's terrible. Humans treat other people horribly. We're all in this in versus out. But what did you see that humanized them that almost cannot serve to not make us feel sorry for them, right? Or anything like that, or feel sorry that they lost, certainly, right? Or lost. I know there's these consequences still occurring now, serious consequences. But when you went into and entered into their mind as best as you could, what did that teach you? And then how can it teach us about, like, you can change a law, you can try to force something, but there's a difference between changing a law that creates a coercive force behind a certain policy or view and the actual imagination, the actual religious imagination of a community. Where they actually get to the place where they don't think segregation is wrong because the Supreme Court said, or because, whatever it is, but they think it's wrong because there's a deeply held religious conviction about it. And I guess, yeah, I mean, how does this teach us? Essentially, I'm trying to get at the lesson for us.
Yeah.
Right now. And I know we've been kind of going through this, but I'd love for you to encapsulate it, maybe, and summarize it for us. The lesson that we're learning from how the church responded to segregation and its dismantling.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that question, Josh. I think that when I think about what I learned from these folks in terms of like empathizing with them, I think as you read their letters and read their sermons, there is just such a desire for certainty, a desire to say like, hey, this is as plain as day. This is what God means. And so if I'm trying to extend empathy to them, what I can see in them and what I can see in myself and my own folks today is, man, oh man, we human beings want certainty. We desire certainty so much that we are willing to say in absolute terms, this is what God believes. This is what God thinks. And so I think if there's a lesson from us today, it is that I think it should teach us some humility about the way that we as Christians today approach our certainty about topics. I had a colleague here at Indiana Wesleyan who was fond of saying that we should hold our beliefs deeply, but hold them loosely. And I think that there is a lesson to be learned there as we think about these folks in the past, that they weren't doing these things because they were trying to be racist. They didn't have these beliefs because they wanted to be wrong. They had these things because they wanted to be the most faithful, certain people about what God intended that they could be. And that led them to this place of 60 years later looking like pretty bad. And so I think that if we could take a lesson from it, it may be to hold our beliefs deeply but loosely, and maybe resist the temptation of certainty, of knowing, of having all the answers, because it's when we are, I think, most certain that we are most prone to error. And if we can keep the quiver of I don't know or I'm unsure in our intellectual quiver, I think that we will be well served by that. That's, I think, the beauty of history. It teaches us that time and again that let's be humble and about what we know and can know.
I love that, and it's consistent with a lot of some of the other books I've read about just being really firm in our ideology. Those that are the most ideological, did I say that right? Those that are the most ideological tend to have the biggest blind spots. And yeah. I think that's so true. But Yeah. So my last question to you, Rusty, is, you're a historian of many means, and you've been doing this for a while. This is America's 250th anniversary. I'd love for you just to reflect a little bit on what does this moment mean to you? 250 years of America, and even think, more broadly, just religion in America. What does this moment in American history mean to you?
Yeah, I think that to go back to maybe where we started this interview, I think one of the things that I am just kind of struck by the more that I study American history is, especially America's religious history, is this continuing theme of a theological crisis. And so I think if we can take that outside of the Civil War period that it's often applied to as this theological crisis that kind of led to the Civil War, and extend that both before and after, I think the story of religion in America for 250 years has been a story of people disagreeing about what the Bible says and what God intends. And I think that our moment today seems polarized, and indeed is polarized, but I don't think we should lose heart that this is something completely unique in our history, that this is kind of like a continuing theme that we have, and that if we perhaps seek understanding and unity in these moments of polarization, that maybe the way forward is to kind of try to recapture that gospel call of unity, rather than ever more increasingly divorcing ourselves from people who don't think the same way we do about how we read our Bibles or what the Bible means.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Rusty, for
coming
back and chatting with us. This has been great.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I'm proud to be part of this series.
Yeah. And to our audience, hey, thanks again for stopping by. Make sure you check out all of the other episodes that we have in the queue. There's a lot more coming. And yeah, we're just really, really glad that you made it this far in the video. And as always, make sure you keep our conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Hey, welcome back to Faithful Politics, and for our brief little interview with the one and only Sarah Stancorp. How's it going, Sarah?
Good. It's going well. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, so at this year's Southern Baptist Convention, and I'm no expert, but I can read the news, they voted overwhelmingly to advance some sort of formal ban on churches with women pastors. And your book, Damned If She Does, looks at why women are leaving the church and what that means for the future of religion. So I'd love for you just to, maybe give us what's one story that helps explain how a decision like what happened at the SBC shouldn't really surprise anybody.
So when I had the idea to write this book probably over a decade ago, I thought it would be very contemporary and how now we're decades hence. And when I sat down to write the book, I realized I actually needed to start in the 1980s because a lot of the threads that became important in women's lives started then. And I know this mini interview may become part of a broader conversation on Christian nationalism. As I look at the way evangelicalism, how the Christian right has embedded itself with our politics and really turned into a Christian nationalist machine, a big piece of that is Christian patriarchy. The way women are oppressed within this system is kind of a model for oppression of all of us. So jumping back to the beginning of the book, I started with Danuta Soderman, who was a co-host of the 700 Club with Pat Robertson, and she was granted a bit of influence there. She could talk to the country. She could even preach sometimes. God forbid. But she also was bounded by certain rules. She could have this influence if she followed certain rules. And as soon as she didn't, as soon as she was a threat that Robertson needed to dispose of, she was gone. When I think about the SBC And I think about just year after year, amendments like this come up, attempting to silence women after women have worked so hard to press SBC for reform on sex abuse. This is no coincidence. When I look at that trajectory, and there are still women in SBC, many are leaving, a lot of people have left SBC, I see women who are making some sort of compromise. And they're there, whether it's for comfort or community, or because they're too scared to leave and they know what they'll lose if they leave. They're making a deal, but they're eventually gonna lose. And I think that's the heartbreaking part of seeing what's happening now within that denomination. Is it's bad for the church. It certainly isn't good evangelism. But it's also so bad for women who, the longer they stay and tolerate being treated like this, it breaks them down. And eventually the only way to safety is to leave.
Wow. Well, your book, The Damned As She Does, when does it come out and where can people buy it?
September 15th, and everywhere. Everywhere we can get a book, you can buy a book there. It's going to be a big publication day. A bunch of other big books are coming out then. So I'm hopeful September is going to be a good month for dialogue about faith in America, especially in our current political situation.
Yeah. And your website?
sarahstancorp.com.
That's easy. And I will make sure all of this is in the show notes. And thanks again, Sarah, for stopping by and telling us about your book.
Thank you.
Awesome.